Commander Vecral floated in his observation station, his three eyes carefully watching the blue and green planets spinning below him. He was a Thurians, and everyone in the galaxy knew that his people were the best at understanding war. They were like the galaxy's historians and teachers of how to win wars. The Thurians had been watching and writing down every major battle and conflict in known space for 2,000 years. They had stayed safe and respected because of their advice and knowledge. No one wanted to attack them because the Thurians knew every trick, strategy, and possible way a war could go. Vecral thought this job was just another normal task. There were 3 human colonies on the planet New Haven, and they were about to be attacked by a strong military group called the Kaarthak Dominion. These strange beings called humans walked on 2 legs and had only been part of the galactic community for about 70 years. 70 years was nothing to Vecral, who had studied ancient civilizations that had been exploring space for thousands of years. People were like kids playing with spaceships. Vecral thought that humans were primitive based on everything he had read and studied. Compared to most other species in the galaxy, their technology was old. Their weapons were basic and rough. It was almost funny how little they knew about how to use military tactics. The Thurians had whole libraries full of rules for war that had been improved over thousands of years. People were just starting to learn how to build a good starship. Vecral brought up the intelligence reports on his screens and went over them again. The Kaarthak were sending 47 warships to this system. 47. That was a very strong force by any standard. These ships weren't little either. They were real military ships with strong weapons, strong shields, and crews that knew what they were doing. The Kaarthak Dominion was a mid-level power in the galaxy. It wasn't the strongest, but it wasn't weak either. They were aware of what they were doing. There were about 2 million people living in the human colonies on New Haven. Vecral looked through the demographic data. Most of them were farmers who grew food for other human worlds. There were miners in the mountains taking minerals out. A few small trading posts. Families. Regular people trying to get by on a world on the edge of space, far from Earth, the home world of humans. Vecral knew what would happen next because of what the humans didn't have. His sensors had scanned the planet and the space around it several times. There were no platforms for defending the orbit. Those were the huge weapons bases that protected important worlds. They were full of cannons and missile launchers. New Haven didn't have anything like that. There was no fleet of people in the system. Not a single ship of war. There are no destroyers, cruisers, or carriers. Just some civilian trucks and buses. The 3 settlements were all on the same continent. They weren't even protected. From his spot on the moon, Vecral could see the layouts clearly. There were farming communities with fields that went on for miles. Mining operations with tools made for digging, not fighting. Little towns with homes, schools, and stores. These people were not soldiers. They were just regular people trying to start over on a colony world. Vecral thought to himself. This will be over in 2 days, as he turned on his recording equipment. He had to write down everything for the report he would write later. Maybe 3 if the people are stubborn and fight back. He got comfortable in his observation post. The station was built into the surface of New Haven's biggest moon, where it was safe and hidden. From this point, his sensors could keep an eye on everything that happened in the system. Every move of the ship, every message, and every shot fired. He had the best view of the battle that was about to happen. Or, more accurately, the coming slaughter. His math said that the Kaarthak fleet would be there in a few hours. They would come out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system, line up in their usual invasion formation, and then head toward the planet. Once they were in charge of the orbit, they would start attacking any defensive positions. The human shields wouldn't last long. The settlements would have a chance to give up. When they did, Kaarthak ground troops would land and take over the colonies. Vecral had seen this kind of military operation dozens of times before. Vecral would be back at the Concordat Academy next week to share what he had learned. He could already see the lecture hall full of students who were excited to learn from another real-life example. The title of this case study could be Overwhelming Force Against an Unprepared Colony, or The Importance of Orbital Defense in Modern Warfare. It would be a perfect example for a textbook, and it would probably be used to teach for the next 100 years. Vecral was happy with his work. In his long career he had seen 63 wars. Some had been small fights between systems that were close to each other. Others had been huge wars that involved many species and dozens of worlds. He had seen sieges, battles in space, and invasions of planets. Before the fighting even started, he always knew what would happen. That was a good analysis. That was how well he understood military doctrine. He had never been wrong about how a war would end. In 63 wars, not once. That perfect record was about to be broken in the worst way possible. Vecral didn't know that yet, though. He sat in his observation post at ease and sure of himself, waiting for the Kaerthak fleet to show up. He was ready with his recording gear. He was ready with his analysis frameworks. He already had an idea of what his report would look like. For the galaxy's best military observer, this was just another day at work. New Haven, the blue-green planet, kept slowly spinning below him. The human settlements glowed softly in the dark, like little lights that stood for 2 million lives. Families, homes, and farms going about their daily lives without knowing that a huge army was about to attack them. Everything would be different in a few hours. The Kaerthak would come with 47 warships. And Vekral would learn a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He would find out that humans who were new to galactic society and not very advanced had been studying war for a long time. For thousands of years they had been practicing it on themselves, not on other species. The galaxy was about to find out what humans could really do when they were pushed too far. And Vekral, the observer who had never been wrong, would have the sad job of writing it all down. The Kaerthak fleet showed up out of nowhere, dropping out of faster-than-light travel in a flash of warped space. From his moon base, Vekral saw them as a swarm of metal bugs coming down on their prey. 47 ships of different sizes appeared in the dark of space, and their running lights made a constellation of danger above New Haven. Vekral's tools started to list each ship right away. There were huge battle cruisers, each one almost a kilometer long and full of weapon ports. The smaller destroyers moved quickly and deadly around the bigger ships like wolves. Troop carriers stayed in the back of the formation, ready to drop off their soldiers when the fighting was over. Vekral had seen this kind of invasion pattern 100 times before in his studies. Admiral Thrak was in charge of the Kaerthak force, and from what Vekral could see, the admiral was following all the rules. First, you take control of the area around the planet so that no enemy reinforcements can get there. Then you bomb any defensive positions from space where they can't fight back well. Lastly, you send your ground troops down to take control of the land you won. It was military strategy 101, which every species in the galaxy learned. Starting bombardment sequence, Vekral set into his recording device, which recorded everything he saw. It was simple, effective, and had been used in wars for thousands of years. His voice was calm and professional, like a doctor writing down symptoms during a checkup. The Kaerthak fleet's first weapons were fired. Bright beams of superheated plasma, each one strong enough to destroy a city block, shot down through New Haven's atmosphere toward the northern colony. Vekral saw the shields of the settlement come on. They were a shimmering dome of energy that was meant to deflect incoming fire. The shields held for a few seconds, taking the plasma hits in flashes of light. Then they didn't work. The energy dome flickered, shook, and then fell apart. The plasma lances hit the ground directly, and Vekral saw explosions spread out across the colony. Buildings that had just housed families were now in ruins. Human defensive capabilities insufficient as predicted, Vekral wrote down on his data pad. Everything was going just as he had planned. The bombardment kept going with brutal efficiency. The Kaerthak didn't want to wipe out the colonies completely, they just wanted to make them weak enough that they couldn't organize a fight. More plasma strikes hit the other two towns. The power grids went down. Towers for communication fell down. The bright lights that had shown the way to the human towns from space started to go out one by one. All 3 colonies were completely dark within 20 minutes. Vekral's sensors showed that there were no more messages coming from the surface. There were no distress calls, no military chatter, or anything else. The life sign readings, which measured the heat and biological markers of living things, went down a lot. It looked like a lot of people died, just like you would expect from an orbital bombardment on civilians who weren't protected. Vekral nodded to himself and wrote down more notes with his tentacles moving quickly. He had to admit that the Kaerthak were very good at this. They had taken out 3 different settlements in less time than it took most species to take over one. The fleet was already moving on to the next stage, putting their ships in a tight orbit right above the colonies they had just taken over. From this place they could quickly send out their troop carriers and start the occupation. Everything was going exactly as the military said it should. Vekral was already writing parts of his report in his head. This would be a great example of how to use overwhelming force and follow the rules for invading. His students would benefit greatly from this. Then all at once, every alarm in his observation post started to scream. Vekral's 3 eyes got bigger in shock when his sensors picked up something that shouldn't have been there. Energy signatures were going up all over the surface of the planet. Big energy signatures like the ones that came from military-grade weapons systems. But that didn't make sense. His scans had shown that those colonies had no defenses. There were no guns down there. The surface of the planet exploded, but it wasn't the random chaos of a settlement dying in its last moments. This was planned. This was exact. This was in the works. The grain silos, which Vekral had carefully listed in his pre-battle analysis as large cylindrical buildings where farmers stored their crops, suddenly opened up like mechanical flowers. But instead of grain they showed something else entirely. Big railgun installations came up from underground bunkers, with their long barrels pointing up at the sky. These buildings had nothing to do with farming. They were weapons platforms that had been covered up and hidden. The farms had been hidden. The fields, barns and farming tools had all been part of a complicated trick. And those miners that Vekral had seen in his intelligence reports, the people he thought were just workers digging for minerals? They had been soldiers all along, training and waiting for this moment. Impossible, Vekral said, his voice shaking with disbelief. My scans didn't show anything. How did they keep this a secret? The energy signatures alone should have. Instead of words, action answered his question. The first railgun shot. The Kaerthak used plasma weapons that were bright and easy to see. The railgun slug, on the other hand, was almost invisible. It was just a solid piece of metal, but it was moving at 17 kilometers per second. Electromagnetic forces sped it up to speeds that turned simple matter into a deadly weapon. The slug hit the Kaerthak battlecruiser right in the middle. The ship didn't blow up in a big fireball like in the movies. That wasn't possible. At that speed, the kinetic energy was so great that the battlecruiser stopped being a useful ship. The metal slug went through the hull, the decks, the engine core and out the other side in a split second. The huge warship fell apart because its structure couldn't handle the terrible damage. In a matter of seconds, it was just a cloud of debris moving through space. After that, another railgun shot. And one more. And another. It turned out that the 3 colonies, which were spread out across the continent, were 3 different firing positions. The railguns could fire in all directions, covering all possible approaches. The Kaerthak fleet had just made themselves the perfect target by getting together in that tight orbital formation to get ready for occupation. They had turned into the biggest shooting range in the galaxy, and the people were aiming very carefully. Vekral's hands were shaking as he hurriedly changed his instruments to keep track of everything that was going on. He was no longer calm at work, he was in shock. The Kaerthak ships were trying to break up now, and their engines were flaring as they tried to get away from the killing zone. But that's not how space battles work. You can't just move out of the way. The Kaerthak didn't have time and every movement took time. The railguns kept firing with perfect accuracy. Each shot was carefully planned, taking into account the target's speed, path, and moves to avoid being hit. These weren't shots taken in a panic by defenders who were in trouble. This was a coordinated firing solution that had likely been planned and practiced many times before. As the numbers rose, Vekral watched his instruments in horror. 5 Kaerthak ships were sunk. 10, 15, 20. The debris field in space was getting bigger by the second and spreading out in a ring around the planet. The ships that had been fine and working just a few minutes ago were now just wreckage. 4 minutes. That was all it took. 31 Kaerthak ships were destroyed in 4 minutes of continuous railgun fire. More than 2/3 of their whole invasion force was gone, turned into clouds of metal fragments and frozen air that kept getting bigger. Vekral had thought the colonies would give up, but they didn't. They hadn't even been hurt that much. The bombardment casualties he wrote down were fake and part of the trick. The humans had been quiet and patient while they waited for the Kaerthak to get into position. The people had made their own towns into bait. They had set up a complicated trap that involved 2 million of their own people, including their families and kids. And they had done it so well that Vekral, the best military observer in the galaxy, didn't have a clue. Vekral had never been in a situation like this before in his long career and didn't know what was going on. Everything he thought he knew about how humans fight, their basic skills, and their simple strategies had just been proven to be completely wrong. And this was just the start. Even with the mechanical translation, you could hear the panic in Admiral Throck's voice. All ships fall back. We give up. The transmission went out on every available communication frequency, sending the message of the Kaerthak's unconditional surrender to anyone who would listen. It was a sign to everyone that the battle was over and that the losing side was giving up. The last 16 Kaerthak ships, which were all that was left of the 47-ship invasion fleet, broke up their formation. Their engines were running at full power, trying to speed up as fast as they could toward the edge of the star system. They could get away if they could just get to the point where they could turn on their faster-than-light drives. They could go back home. They could stay alive. Vekral leaned forward in his observation station, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. At last, this nightmare was going to do things the right way. Good, he said to himself, his voice shaky but full of hope. The humans will agree to the terms of surrender. This is how things are done all over the galaxy. For as long as civilizations have been fighting wars, there have been rules in all of known space. Rules that everyone knew but didn't write down. The fighting stops when you give up. You might have to pay reparations, lose your land, or even have your military broken up, but you still get to live. Giving up was holy. It had to be that way, or else every war would end with the last person standing, and the galaxy would fall apart. People didn't respond with words. It came in the form of action, and that action made Vekral's blood run cold. His sensors suddenly lit up with huge energy signatures all over the asteroid belt that surrounded the system's outer edges. Ships were coming out of hiding, their stealth systems shutting down to show they were there. Not just a few boats. A lot of them. Sleek human frigates had been waiting there in perfect silence, their engines running so cold that standard scanners couldn't see them. These ships had been hiding in the rocks and ice of the asteroid belt the whole time. The Kaerthak had been looking at the planet and the Vekral had been looking at the colonies. A whole fleet of humans had been set up in a wide net around the edge of the system. Now they moved with deadly purpose, their engines roaring to life as they formed a blockade between the fleeing Kaerthak ships and the freedom of open space. The Kaerthak were stuck. There were still working railgun installations on the planet behind them. The fleet of people was ahead of them. There was no way out. "This is Admiral Throck of the Kaerthak Dominion." The voice came through again, this time more desperate and full of the kind of fear that comes when you know you're going to die. "We admit that we have lost completely and ask for terms of surrender according to galactic law." A railgun slug shot from one of the human frigates went right through Admiral Throck's flagship. The huge command ship shook as the kinetic projectile ripped through its hull, the command deck where Throck had been broadcasting from, and out the other side. The message stopped in the middle of a sentence and ended with a burst of static. There would be no conditions for surrender. There would be no deal. Vekral's 3 eyes were wide open in shock as he watched the humans start what could only be called a hunt. In the traditional sense, this was no longer a battle. Battles had goals, plans, and objectives that went beyond just destroying things. What Vekral was seeing now was different and much more scary. The humans were carefully destroying every Kaerthak ship in the system. Vekral had only seen natural hunters stalking prey move with the same kind of predatory patience as the human ships. The humans had already thought of every possible way that the Kaerthak ships could try to get away, so when they tried to scatter in different directions, hoping that at least some of them would get away, they were ready. It was as if they knew what the Kaerthak would do before they did it. There were human frigates waiting at every escape route, so there was no way to get away. A group of Kaerthak ships tried to come together to make a defensive sphere where they could combine their shields and fire at enemies from behind. It was a last-ditch effort that made sense from a tactical point of view. In most cases, it would have given them a chance to win. The people used what Vekral's sensors first picked up as debris fields. Metal and rock pieces floating in space, the kind of wreckage you'd expect to see after a fight. The Kaerthak formation moved toward this wreckage, maybe thinking it could help them hide. After that, the debris came to life. Those pieces of metal weren't broken pieces at all. They were mines, which are advanced explosives that had been made to look like harmless space junk. They all went off at the same time, blowing up in a way that tore apart the Kaerthak defensive formation. The explosives were placed just right to rip apart ships that had been fine just a few moments before. One Kaerthak destroyer was able to limp away from the main fighting after a railgun hit its engines hard. The captain of the ship made a smart choice by going to the system's gas giant, a huge planet with thick rings of ice and rock around it. The destroyer went into those rings, hoping to blend in with the billions of particles that made up the planetary ring system. Sensors couldn't get through the rings very well because they were so thick. It was a good place to hide. Still, the people found it. A human frigate fired a single railgun slug through the planetary ring system 6 hours later, after carefully following the faint heat signature that the damaged destroyer couldn't quite hide. Vekral could barely understand the math that went into the shot. The slug had to take into account the ring's orbital speed, the gas giant's gravity, the target's rotation, and the movements of millions of ice particles that could have changed the shot's path. It was the kind of orbital mechanics problem that would take Vekral's people days to figure out, even with their best computers. They did it in 6 hours and hit the target perfectly. The destroyer died quietly in the rings, like any other piece of trash in a sea of ice. The hunt lasted for a full 9 hours. Vekral wrote down every single minute of it. His academic training made him write down everything, even though his professional distance broke down and was replaced by something like horror. He watched as the humans did things that shouldn't have been possible for a species that was so young. He saw that they didn't use energy weapons at all. Everything was moving and simple metal slugs were flying at amazing speeds. It was easy to see and follow energy weapons, and it was easy to guess where they would go. But kinetic weapons were almost impossible to see until they hit. You couldn't see them coming through space. It had already killed you by the time you found the slug. The human ships worked together perfectly over long distances, moving in patterns that suggested they were always talking to each other. But Vekral's sensors couldn't pick up any signals between them. Nothing, not even radio waves or laser communications. Either they were using communication methods that were so advanced that his equipment couldn't pick them up, or they had planned this operation so well that every ship knew exactly what to do without having to talk to each other. Vekral thought that some of the Karthak ships might be able to get away when the human frigates' railguns ran out of ammo. Instead, he watched in shock as human ships on purpose ran into Karthak ships that were already damaged. They used their own ships as weapons, giving up their ships to make sure that not a single Karthak got away. By the 9th hour, the star system was completely quiet, except for the slow growth of debris fields. Pieces of Karthak ships floated in space around New Haven and all over the system, making fake meteor showers that would probably last for years. No Karthak ships were still in use. Not a single one. Vekral checked and double-checked his sensors, hoping to find at least one ship that had somehow gotten away or hidden well. There was nothing there. The people had found every single ship. There were no survivors found. The people didn't try to save any Karthak crew members who might have gotten away in life pods. No one was taken prisoner. Now all of the Karthak who had come into this system were dead. Vekral's tentacles shook uncontrollably as he stared at his screens. He had never seen anything like this in his 200 years of watching wars between dozens of species and 63 different conflicts. There were rules for war in the galaxy. Those rules had been in place for thousands of years of civilization. Surrender was sacred because it had to be. Both sides knew that they might be the next ones to be caught, so they traded prisoners. After winning, the goal was to control the land, not just kill everyone. The people had broken every single one of those rules. They had turned down surrender. They had said they wouldn't take prisoners. They hadn't taken over anything because there was no one left to fight against. In the usual sense, this wasn't a military victory. The people hadn't won the fight. They had done what could only be called genocide, killing off an entire military force and everyone in it. The scariest part was how calm and methodical they had been about it. Vekral was frantically putting away his observation equipment, his academic curiosity completely overtaken by his need to survive. He had to get out of this system right away and tell someone what he had seen. As he got his ship ready to leave, his hands were still shaking and his mind was racing with images of the slaughter he had just seen. Then his sensors picked up something that made his heart stop. A single ship with people on board was coming toward his observation post on the moon. The frigate moved slowly and on purpose, and Vekral could see the scars on its hull from the last battle. Burn marks from near misses and parts of armor that had been replaced were clear signs that the ship had been in the thick of the fighting. The frigate stopped completely just outside of weapon range. Close enough to talk clearly, but far enough away that Vekral couldn't say he was being threatened. It was a planned distance, and that level of accuracy scared him more than if they had just aimed their guns at him. A message came in on his communication console. It was just text, and it was written in Galactic Standard, which is the official language used for communication between species. The message was clear and to the point, 6 words that meant a lot. You could watch. Give them a look. Before Vekral could even think about what to say, his computers beeped to let him know that data was coming in. A huge data packet was being sent to the memory banks of his observation station. The file was huge and seemed to have thousands of documents, pictures, and videos in it. Vekral's eyes got bigger when he saw what was inside. Military history of people. Not just recent history from their time in space, but also thousands of years of war that happened when humans were still living on one planet. Vekral didn't know what the names of the wars meant because he had never studied human history in depth. The First World War. The Second World War. Vietnam. Syria. The fights over unification. The wars over water, the rebellions and business. There have been conflicts after conflicts after conflicts for thousands of years. Vekral wasn't bothered by the names, though. The pictures were what it was. The pictures and videos told a story that was worse than anything he could have imagined. He saw people using chemical weapons to fight each other, clouds of poison gas rolling over battlefields, and soldiers choking and dying in trenches. He saw whole cities turn to ash and rubble, and atomic bombs made mushroom clouds that rose into the sky like monuments to destruction. He saw videos of airstrikes that turned cities into wastelands. He saw tanks smashing houses, soldiers with flamethrowers, and naval battles where thousands of people died in minutes. This was something the people had done to themselves. To their own kind. For thousands of years. Vecral had to look up some of the ideas and words in the data because they weren't used in most galactic cultures. This scorched earth strategy involved destroying everything in your own territory so that the enemy couldn't use it, even if it meant your own people would starve. Mutually assured destruction was a belief that both sides had enough weapons to wipe each other out completely, and the fear of total extinction was supposed to keep the peace. War crimes was probably the most telling word of all because it suggested that people had rules for war, but they only made those rules because they kept breaking them in the most horrible ways. There was a second transmission, and this time it was sound. A calm, measured voice, a woman's, that made the words even more scary. Observer Vecral of the Concordat. My name is Captain Diane Torres, and I am in charge of New Haven's Human Defense Fleet. Your people study war, so let me teach you something you obviously don't know. The Kaarthak attacked civilian colonies without warning or a declaration of war. They went after schools where our kids go to learn. They went after hospitals where sick people go to get better. They went after farms where our families work. These are not military bases. They are places where regular people live their lives. There was a pause, and Vecral could hear the cold precision in her voice. She chose each word carefully and spoke with complete confidence. In human culture, that's not warfare. That's a whole different thing. That's what we call crimes against humanity, terrorism, or a massacre. And we know exactly how to respond to those things. Captain Torres kept talking, and her voice never got higher or showed any emotion, which made it worse in some way. We have a lot of laws about war, observer. Rules that tell our soldiers how to fight. The Geneva Conventions protect civilians and prisoners. Rules of behavior that our soldiers have to follow. We made up all those rules and laws because we know what happens when we don't follow them. We know what happens when people go to war without limits. 10,000 years ago we did it to ourselves. Another pause to let that sink in. The Kaarthak chose to fight outside of those rules. They decided to attack civilians, to do so without warning, and to ignore all the rules of civilized warfare. We did the same thing. We met them where they wanted to. Observer, this wasn't anger. This wasn't a decision made in the heat of the moment or because of how I felt. This was planned. This was on purpose. We were sending a message to everyone in the galaxy. If you attack our civilians, your military can't go home. Always. The broadcast went on with tactical footage from the point of view of people. Vecral was shocked when the data showed him what had really been going on in New Haven for months before the attack. He saw soldiers in the colonies who were living two lives at once. During the day they worked in the fields like any other farmer, planting crops and gathering grain. But they trained at night. Secretly they did combat drills, practiced with weapons and ran tactical simulations. Over the course of 2 years he watched as the railgun installations were built. Huge underground bunkers are being dug under what look like normal grain storage silos. The weapons are being put together piece by piece and smuggled in on cargo ships that look like farming tools. Every step was planned and carried out with a level of patience that most species couldn't even imagine. The people had run hundreds of computer simulations to figure out exactly how the Kaarthak would attack. They had looked at Kaarthak military doctrine, looked at their past campaigns and made psychological profiles of their leaders. The ambush wasn't a stroke of luck or a spur-of-the-moment idea. It was a carefully planned trap that had been in the works for years of gathering and analyzing information. The most disturbing thing of all was that Vecral saw records that showed the people of New Haven had known. They knew they were being used as bait. They knew the Kaarthak would come after them. They knew that people would die in the first attack. And they still volunteered. 2 million people had agreed to live in a target zone for 2 years, trusting that their military would turn their sacrifice into victory. Show the galaxy what happens when you make humans choose between civilization and survival, Captain Torres said, her voice calm and steady. Observer, we like civilization better. We made rules, laws, and customs because we want to be civilized. But we're really good at the other thing. We've been doing this for 10,000 years. The engines of the human ship started up, and the frigate started to move away from Vecral's observation post. No threats, no demands, and no more talking. They had said what they needed to say and gotten their point across. Now that they were done with their work, they were leaving. Vecral sat completely still for more than an hour, his tentacles still and his 3 eyes fixed on the data that was still scrolling across his screens. He was trying to make sense of what he had learned by combining it with what he already knew about galactic warfare. Because their technology was behind that of other species, the galaxy had always thought humans were primitive. Their ships were slower, their weapons were easier to use, and their infrastructure wasn't as good. But Vecral now knew that people didn't need better weapons. They needed good opponents. They had been fighting each other for 10,000 years, getting better at killing other people. Every tactic, strategy, and horrible way of fighting had been tried and improved over thousands of years of fighting between people. The Kaerthak were like kids playing with fire when they fought humans. They didn't know how dangerous it was until they were already on fire. But the scariest thing about all the information Captain Torres had sent was hidden in the military doctrine files. In human military language, the attack on New Haven, the complete destruction of an entire invasion fleet, and the systematic hunting down and killing of every Kaerthak ship all had official names. They called it a limited retaliatory response. On their scale of 10 for military response, it got a 3. 3 out of 10. Vekral's hands shook as he started to write his report. He already knew for sure that what he was about to send to the Galactic Concordat would change everything. The galaxy needed to know the truth about humans. Not primitive newcomers, but the most dangerous species to ever fly in space. They learned how to fight by almost destroying themselves instead of conquering others. The Grand Council chamber of the Galactic Concordat was one of the most beautiful rooms in all of space. There were 300 different species representatives in a huge circular arena where they talked about issues that affected the whole galaxy. The walls were made of a type of crystal that looked like it had its own light coming from inside. Holographic displays floated in the air and could show information to all 300 delegates at once, no matter what kind of eyes or other senses they had. At that moment, the beautiful room was completely quiet. Every delegate, ambassador, and representative from every civilized part of space was looking at the pictures that Vekral had just shown them. The presentation was over, but the last pictures stayed frozen on the huge central screen, where everyone could see them clearly. There were pictures of Kaerthak warships that had been ripped apart, with their hulls ripped open by kinetic weapons moving at speeds that were impossible to imagine. There were wide shots of debris fields spreading through space. These were the remains of what had once been a powerful fleet of invaders. And there was one last picture that seemed even more haunting than all the destruction, death, and wreckage. It showed the 3 human colonies on New Haven from space at night, with their lights shining brightly and cheerfully, as if nothing had happened at all. The first person to speak up was Grand Chancellor Mortok. He was part of a species that was made up of living crystal. When he spoke, his whole body bent the light in the room into rainbow patterns. He sounded like someone who had led the Concordat for more than 100 years. "You're absolutely sure of these findings, Observer Vekral?" he asked. There was something in his voice that made it sound like he really wanted to be told that this was all a mistake. The humans on purpose let their own civilians be targeted? Did they use their own people as bait? When Vekral answered, his voice was rough. He hadn't slept much since he left New Haven 2 weeks ago. He saw those Kaerthak ships being hunted down one by one every time he closed his eyes. "Yes, Chancellor. I checked everything several times. And those civilians signed up for it. They all knew what was going to happen. People have a name for this plan. Bait protocol is what they call it. Based on the historical data they gave me, they've used similar tactics throughout their history, going back to World War II, which was more than 300 years ago." A murmur spread through the room like a wave. For most of the species there, 300 years didn't seem like much. The Thurians had been studying war for 2,000 years. The Sorvani kept military records for 5,000 years. Some of the older species in the chamber had civilizations that had been around for tens of thousands of years. 300 years was like yesterday to them. The humans were coming up with and improving complicated military strategies when they were still very young. Next, Counselor Thress from the Vicarian Empire spoke. The Vicarians were one of the more warlike races in the galaxy. They were proud of their military history and achievements. She sounded openly doubtful, almost like she didn't care. "Observer Vekral, with all due respect to your knowledge, are you saying that humans are somehow more dangerous than species with much better technology?" The Kaerthak had 47 modern warships. They had plasma lance weapons that could cut through most types of armor. They had quantum shielding, slipspace drives, and all the other benefits of cutting-edge galactic technology. How could primitive kinetic weapons possibly? Because the weapons don't matter. It was very strange for Vekral to speak up. He was usually very controlled, studious, and proper. But his tentacles were twisting and turning with an unusual amount of force, which is a sign that his species was very upset. "Counselor, please, you need to get this. I've studied a lot of wars in my career, but I've never seen a species that fights like humans do. He took a moment to calm down before speaking again in a calmer voice. Most cultures, including ours, see war as an extension of politics. We use it to reach certain goals. We have made rules, protocols, and terms of surrender that everyone knows and follows. We fight until the cost of continuing is higher than the possible benefit, and then we work out a deal. War makes sense. There is control over war. War has limits. Vecral brought up another screen that showed records of human history. The chamber watched as pictures of wars that had gone on for years, not days or weeks, went by. Some had been going on for years. Some wars lasted for real centuries, with whole generations being born, living, and dying during them. Humans see war differently, Vecral said. They think of it as a tool with different settings, like changing the power level on a weapon. They can fight what they call a police action, which is very limited and controlled. They can fight a regular war with specific military goals. He stopped for a moment to look at the military doctrine scale that Captain Torres had sent him. Or they can fight what they call total war, he said. They gave New Haven a 3 out of 10 on their military response scale. In their own words, what we saw was a limited retaliatory action. Again the chamber got very quiet. Chancellor Mortok leaned in, and the light hit his crystal body. When he talked it was hard to hear him. And what is a 10 observer? Vecral showed a picture from the past on Earth. It showed a huge explosion with a cloud of fire and smoke rising into the air in the shape of a mushroom, which is what atomic bombs are known for. There was a city, or what had once been a city, below it. It was just gone now. They call it mutually assured destruction, Vecral said in a low voice. To completely destroy the enemy no matter what it costs them. The people made weapons that could wipe out all life on their planet. They made enough of these weapons to kill every person dozens of times. And they were ready to use them. A few times they almost did it in just a few minutes. While perfecting the idea they almost wiped out their own kind. The room was filled with shocked voices. Some delegates were scared while others were in disbelief. Most galactic civilizations didn't believe that any species would be willing to kill itself just to make sure the enemy was also killed. The first thing to do was to stay alive. Self-preservation was supposed to come before everything else. Vecral waited for the noise to stop before moving on to the most important part of his speech. People have a lot of rules about how to fight, like laws and customs that tell them how to do it. But there is one rule that is more important than all the others. Never on purpose target civilians. The Kaerthak didn't follow that rule. They bombed homes, attacked settlements, and killed families. And the people didn't fight back with the same amount of force. They didn't destroy a Kaerthak colony in revenge. They completely got rid of the military force that did the act as a response. They set an example that will last for generations in this galaxy. Vecral's report spread like wildfire through galactic society over the next few weeks and months. The official name was, What Happens When You Watch Human Warfare? I Saw a Massacre, became required reading for every military officer, politician, and diplomat in known space. The responses were very different depending on the species and how they felt about humans. The Polythian Hive, a peaceful trading group, quickly contacted human space and signed a formal agreement not to attack each other. They wanted it in writing, with the law, that they would never attack humans or their interests and humans would never attack theirs. The Sorvani Collective, which had some land disputes near human space, quietly pulled all of their military forces out of the border areas. They pulled their fleets back, set up new defensive positions far from any human colonies, and made it clear through back channels that they had no plans to attack. The Kaerthak Dominion itself fell apart into civil war after losing their invasion fleet and their military leaders. Different groups fought over who was responsible for the New Haven disaster. Their empire broke up into many smaller states, and they would never again be a major military power. The Concordat itself went through what could only be called a philosophical crisis. For 2,000 years, the Thurians had been the best military experts in the galaxy because they were better at analyzing and planning than anyone else. But all of their models, theories, and assumptions were based on one basic idea: that all species valued staying alive more than winning. People didn't have this problem. They were more than willing to lose everything if it meant beating an enemy that had crossed certain lines. That made everything different. Vecral's office had become the galaxy's best place to study human military history. His walls were covered with charts that showed how people have fought each other throughout history, how their technology has changed over time, and how their tactics have worked. He was completely obsessed with figuring out how a species that had only been in space for 300 years had come up with such advanced and brutal ways to fight. He was finishing up his report by adding some last comments after months of extra research when a message came in. He had only talked to Captain Torres, the human commander, for a short time in New Haven. It was a short note, but every word meant something. Thank you for being honest, Observer Vecral. War is awful. That's why we're so good at it. We want it to end quickly. The galaxy needed to know that we aren't here to take over. We don't want to rule over other species or build an empire. But we're not prey either. We won't let ourselves be victims. We hope that this lesson stops fights from happening in the future and saves lives in the long run. From the bottom of our hearts, the survivors of New Haven. Vecral stared at that message for a long time before adding a last paragraph to his report. The chamber got very quiet. Chancellor Mortok leaned in, and the light hit his crystal body. When he talked, it was hard to hear him. And what is a 10 observer? Vecral showed a picture from the past on Earth. It showed a huge explosion with a cloud of fire and smoke rising into the air in the shape of a mushroom, which is what atomic bombs are known for. There was a city, or what had once been a city, below it. It was just gone now. They call it mutually assured destruction, Vecral said in a low voice. To completely destroy the enemy no matter what it costs them. The people made weapons that could wipe out all life on their planet. They made enough of these weapons to kill every person dozens of times. And they were ready to use them. A few times they almost did it in just a few minutes. While perfecting the idea, they almost wiped out their own kind. The room was filled with shocked voices. Some delegates were scared, while others were in disbelief. Most galactic civilizations didn't believe that any species would be willing to kill itself just to make sure the enemy was also killed.